Choice, your creative superpower. We have the power to manifest as we dedicate attention to our thoughts, but often miss opportunity to achieve the greatest good. Your superpower is waiting to be unleashed to unlock a fuller, more rewarding world for all. Join us every Thursday at noon Mountain Time for Choice, your creative superpower with Zoe Muro. And now, here's Zoe.
Hello, folks. Welcome to the New Thought Media Network. My name is Zoe Muro, and it is my honor to be your host for Choice, your creative superpower. Each week, we'll be examining ways for you to wield your superpower for the greatest good as you co-create your life experience. If you're coming back, it's good to see you again. If this is your first time, welcome to the show. I'm a religious science practitioner at the Oakland Center for Spiritual Living in Oakland, California, and I'm also a transformational coach. I work with people who are looking to live their lives as fully as possible. In today's episode, episode 10, we'll be exploring how choice relates to grief. Of course, when we speak of grief, we're also speaking of grief and loss, because grief can come from many different possible circumstances. So I see we have some comments here. Bear with me. Let's see what's going on. I see we have Wayne. Hi, Wayne. Good to see you. He's up in Calgary in Canada. And we have Fiona watching from Geneva. Excellent. Always loving having you here, Fiona. Thank you so much. So, folks, today's show, as I said, is going to be about grief and loss and how we can deal with choice to make a big difference in our life. So I want to start with a quote from the psychotherapist and author Ashley Davis Prend. It is very tempting to want to hate grief, to see it as the enemy, the unwelcome guest. Instead, try opening yourself to grief. Ask what it has to teach you. Ask what it is training you to do, to be. Ask this uninvited teacher into your life and notice how things begin to shift. Remember that grief never asks you to let go of love. So we can actually see that there are several opportunities for choice in this one quote alone. Let's start with a simple, but not necessarily easy question. Do I get a choice to grieve or not to grieve? I can answer this in two different and completely opposing ways. Yes, you get a choice. You can always refuse to grieve. For example, you can experience a loss, but consider it to be inconsequential. Or you can refuse to address the loss entirely. There's a reason why the very, very famous Elizabeth Kubler-Ross indicated that the first stage of grief is denial. The second is anger, and the third is bargaining. Or you can say you're refusing to grieve and just stuff the feelings down deep inside. As long as you accept that they are very likely to reemerge over and over again. Usually, as you either face another loss yourself, or even when you witness someone else's loss. These can just come bubbling up to the surface, sometimes bubbling more like an explosion from a volcano. And they will continue to do so until such time as you face them. Now, when we look at these stages of griefs again, we recognize that denial, anger, bargaining, they're all potential aspects of grieving that may very well enable you to move through your grief. Yes, even if you do spend some time in depression before you arrive at acceptance. So these are legitimate. But I will say that I have to put a kind of a big disclaimer here. These are the so-called stages of grief. And they're not necessarily linear, nor do they necessarily always occur, or for each individual. Nor, to be perfectly honest, are they actually even universally agreed upon. If you were to do a search on stages of grief, you would probably find at least 4 or 5 different versions of that, with a larger or smaller number. And we're going to get to this a little bit later, but I wanted to also mention that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had a 6th stage in mind, which was actually something that never got really fleshed out until after her death. That 6th stage is finding meaning. And you know we're going to have to talk about finding meaning. Now, having made this great case for how these stages can provide some insight into what is normal and what is commonplace in grief, I want you to understand this very important distinction. These stages were written to explain the grief associated with imminent death and dying, not necessarily with the process of grief following the loss. So don't be surprised if during the course of your grieving, these stages don't seem to apply to you, because it really depends on what it was that triggered the sense of grief, the loss in the first place. Now, even though Elizabeth Kubler-Ross first created these in her book on death and dying, they have been carried forward even to today in the latest book in that series, which is on grief and grieving, finding meaning. So they do have a place in this process. But I want to get back to our primary focus on choice. All right, I don't want to get too focused on these stages. We started with the idea of turning away from grieving. I mean, that's really where we were talking about this. And recognizing that turning away from grieving is a choice in and of itself, it's not the choice that will necessarily serve us particularly well. So we can see that how we grieve is going to be a choice as well. Do we choose to face it head on? Or do we box it up securely? The idea that someday we're going to open that box of grief whenever we feel ready to address it. There have been times in my own life when the grief that I was feeling was so intense, so heavy, that I needed to put it aside temporarily to allow myself to get some things that were really crucial to my life. I have to get those things done. So, for example, when my mother died, my father was so incapacitated by his grief and his feelings of guilt. This long story there for another time. But he was so overwhelmed that he was actually incapable of making even the smallest decision. So it fell to me to handle the funeral arrangements, notify the family, all that comes with the death of a loved one. My grief needed not to be put aside or put away, but to be respectfully quieted. I remember literally making a deal with myself. Well, I guess I made a deal with grief, I suppose. I said, okay, let me get through this interaction with the lawyers, or this conversation, or this transaction, And then we can sit and let the sadness have its way. I didn't choose not to grieve. I chose a different way to grieve, because making these arrangements, planning what needed to be done, well, all of it actually was part of the grieving process. Hello, Teresa. Good to see you. So, let's see. Where was I? Wow. When I lived back east, people, of course, had funerals. I mean, we always have funerals, but back east, people had memorial services. I mention that because when I moved to California, I saw more and more that people were having celebrations of life rather than memorial services. And that is another grief-related choice. Do I choose to focus on the passing of my loved one, or do I choose to focus on and celebrate the life they led? There's nothing wrong with either choice. But I know for me personally, celebrating their life helps me to focus more on the love and less on the loss. I choose to hold what I have gained from my relationship with the person rather than what I have lost. Now, since grief is not always about losing someone as a result of death, it can be the loss of a situation, a possession, a physical capability, or even the collective grief, such as we felt during these COVID years as a result of social injustices, which have been so rampant. I mean, any of these things can precipitate grief and shape or inform the choices we make in response. Collective grief. That is, grief which is not part of just one person's life, but grieving at the level of a group or a community or a country or even worldwide. It's a very real and very powerful sensation. So what choices can we make here? First of all, as we have seen in other forms of grief, we can choose to address it rather than trying to simply tough it out or as something that only those sensitive types experience, or trying to say it simply doesn't exist, when you can feel that nagging in your gut that the world just seems off somehow. This particular form of avoiding grief by externalizing it completely, that it's something outside of your own experience, it's not going to be successful. Grief simply will not be denied, and it will crop up as other emotional states like irritability, anger, depression. Oh, that sounds familiar. That sounds a lot like those initial stages of grieving. And yeah, if you do not do something to help yourself move through your grief, I'm not saying get over it, I'm saying work with it. Right? Then you have other things that you're going to have to work through. So that brings us to a choice that has tremendous benefit. But in all honesty, it might be a harder choice to make. Putting aside judgment and embracing compassion. If we can recognize and accept that essentially we're all in the same boat, then perhaps we can all row in the same direction and actually get someplace. One advantage that we can have when we deal with collective grief is recognizing that it is a shared experience. And as such, We can choose to work together to address it. I'm not talking about the old adage, misery loves company. No, that's not the point of this at all. I want to go instead with this quote from a Japanese poet by the name of Ryunosuke Satoru, who said, "Individually, we are one drop. Together, we are an ocean." In the past 2+ years, we've seen how a pandemic can bring a sense of loss on a scale few of us would have imagined possible. Yet there is no denying that the loss of life, the loss of financial stability, the loss of social interaction, all of those things, I mean, we can't deny that those things haven't occurred. Now, some of us have chosen to just kind of hunker down, fully expecting it to run its course and move on, as is so often the case with illnesses. This pandemic was too powerful. It was too widespread, too underestimated to behave as we expected. I mean, think about it. Think back 2.5 years ago. You said, "Oh, sure, I'll isolate for a bit. I'll wear my mask." Yep. And we know it's going to be gone. And it didn't. It just stayed. So we had a choice. Refuse to believe that it was truly a serious thing that we had to deal with, which could lead to countless lives lost, or severely impact excuse me. So we had to choose it. Are we going to actually believe that it was serious? Are we going to recognize that countless lives could be lost, severely impacted? Would we respect the danger it posed and fight back? Well, some of us did. Many of us did. Most of the world did. And those of us who chose to fight did so through the now very familiar strategies that we use. We used social distancing, we used masking, we used vaccinations, etc. Those were all choices that we had to make. Excuse me. But along with those choices, we also chose to allow for solutions to emerge, which could give back some of what we lost. And in fact, that could provide us with even more than we could have imagined. And this is one of the great powers of choice, is that it presents us with things that we had not considered. Now, we've seen people choose to embrace technology in creative and marvelous ways. We broaden our reach through the internet, allowing us to engage with our friends and our family in a way and to a degree most of us have never even attempted before. We found different ways to remain connected, and we chose new ways to interact, new ways to celebrate, new ways to learn. So much so that those choices have actually changed the landscape of learning, the landscape for entertainment, and even for worship and other spiritual pursuits. Unfortunately, we have had more than enough examples of collective grief, whether we're speaking of what has been called us by illness, by racism, misogyny, war. Given that grief is collective, why not choose to address it collectively as well? A shared ritual can be a powerful way to acknowledge one's own grief, as well as that of others, and to honor that shared experience. We have the ability to choose to work together. We have the ability to choose to support one another, to see that even in a common cause, our individual experiences vary greatly, and all of that can only strengthen us. But we must make those choices. We must choose to work together. And then we come to another form of grief, anticipatory grief. This is one of the most challenging forms of grief that there is. And yet it's one that is absolutely choice-centric. Anticipatory grief is a term that's often associated with the emotions that arise from impending death, either one's own death or that of another person. Now, in that particular circumstance, the most influential choice would be to focus on the now, putting one's energy and thoughts on making the most of the time remaining. It might mean choosing to spend time with loved ones, ensuring that one's own finances and other personal matters are in order. Maybe it's writing one's memoirs or letters to loved ones. But a word of caution here. If you're speaking with someone who's facing their own imminent death, be careful not to push them or berate them if they're not up to being able to see the moment. Remember, there's no wrong way to grieve. Each person's experience is unique. Choice is personal, and nothing is more personal than the choices that you make regarding your own life. And certainly not how your life ends. Your best choice in those circumstances might very well be for you to listen, to hold the high watch, to witness, and to love. But there are other reasons for anticipatory grief that have different considerations. And there are some common choices with all these different forms of anticipatory grief. Excuse me. The key to understanding the choice then is when you see that the grief is based on what might have happened or what may happen. There's a clue in there because you can see we're talking about conjecture. We're not talking about fact. All right? Completely different situation from someone who is literally terminal. Okay. So the most logical, excuse me, most logical first choice is to consider that an alternative, a more beneficial outcome or circumstance is also very possible. And it kind of negates the reason for grieving in the first place. Once again, I'll get personal here. I was diagnosed with prostate cancer almost a decade ago. It was like, I actually looked it up. It was March 12th, 2013. Now, it's low grade, non-aggressive. So I'm going with a supervised plan of what's called active surveillance rather than going directly to surgery or to radiation. Now, when I first received this diagnosis, by email of all things, I heard cancer. I translated that to death, and I started to grieve, and I anticipated the worst possible outcome. As the weeks went on and I learned more about prostate cancer and my specific circumstances, I gave up my vision of doom. And I set about making my body as inhospitable to cancer as possible. So I want to break down some of the choices that anticipatory grief presented me with. I chose to stop ruminating on possibilities and discern what the actual facts were. I chose to educate myself on the pros and cons of different treatments. I chose to get a second and third medical opinion. I chose to modify my diet, my exercise regimen, so that I could support my immune system and maintain a healthy level of cholesterol, of blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I chose to consider what I would do if the prognosis were dire, which is not the same as imagining that I was dying. It was about looking at how I was living my life and choosing to do whatever I could to live my life as fully as possible. Which, by the way, ultimately led me the science of mind. Imagine that. By the way, all of that, all of those choices, all of that research, the visioning, all of it was done with the help and support of doctors, nurses, family, friends. My point being, I didn't do it alone. One of the most powerful choices we ever can make, and it's so true with grief, is to ask for help, followed very closely by choosing to accept that help. So in 2016, when I was diagnosed again with cancer, this time melanoma, I handled it perfectly. Okay, well, there might have been a setback or two, but I already had a model for how to move forward. So I knew that I had choices. I knew that I had the ability to choose and to choose well. I knew that I had support. So I went from all of the unknowns, all of the fear, all of the doubt, and I went to the things that I could know. Just like when we pray, we always start with what we know. We never go into conjecture. We go to what we know. So, in closing, I want to leave you with these words from a gentleman by the name of Frank Ostaseski, the author of this absolutely brilliant book, The 5 Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully. And specifically, it was his second invitation, which reads, welcome everything, push away nothing. When it comes to grief, that is so very, very powerful. There's no power in our denying the reality. There is power in being able to choose. There is power in being able to see the reality and knowing without a doubt that God's grace, God's love, God's compassion is there for you to choose. So welcome everything, push away nothing. It's your choice. Folks, I'd love to hear what you feel about choice and grief. So please feel free to email me at zodemiro@gmail.com. Should get this up here. Bum, bum, bum. There we go. So you can email me at zodemiro@gmail.com. I would love to hear your thoughts on this topic. And if you have a topic relating to choice that you would like to see me cover, please, by all means, let me know. I truly appreciate your spending time with me this week. But take a look around at ntmedia.org. There's so much going on. Today, for example, I only have a moment here, but today at 12 noon Pacific time, that's 1 p.m. Mountain time, check out Finding the Joy in the Journey with practitioner and soon-to-be minister, the exceptional Gina Colvario-Krupka, and her special guest today, Reverend Cynthia James. So folks, by all means, do what you need to do to build the most magnificent life you can. So until we meet again, choose wisely. Much love and many, many blessings.